The year is 1980. Artists like Pink Floyd, Queen, and Michael Jackson top the charts. And the political, social, and religious turmoil of the 1960s and 70s is coming to a breaking point.
In November, a book will be released that will officially mark the start of the period known as the Satanic Panic. This period was a national phenomenon, but Colorado has an especially rich and impactful history of occult paranoia.
The Satanic Panic was mainly a reaction to the large leaps in social progress of the previous decade and acted as a period of transition.
This is a story that represents larger repeating patterns and themes in human history of conservatism, bias, liberalism, division, and fear.
It gives us a roadmap for how not to look across the lines of political, religious, and social differences to see humanity in the opposing America.
In Colorado, people were afraid. No one was safe. Cattle were being killed and mutilated. Children aren't messing around with G.I. Joe anymore. They've graduated to Damien 2. Teenagers were being indoctrinated into satanic slavery through role-playing games and rock and roll, and adults were suddenly remembering being ritualistically abused as children.
Yet the story doesn't end there, because almost none of this was real. To understand the Satanic Panic as a phenomenon, you need to understand 5 things. Firstly, a large conspiracy of Satanists, driven to perform sacrifices and ceremonies in the name of Satan, has never existed, as found by an investigation by the FBI that took over 10 years to perform. In most cases, in fact, Satanism as a religion doesn't believe in a real Satan. The Church of Satan is instead atheistic.
Second, people truly believed and continue to believe that they and vulnerable populations are in danger from occult activity. While there was never any real threat on the lives of rural Coloradans, these fears have some foundation. In the 1970s, a very tumultuous decade in American history, a relatively new threat emerged. Serial killers and cults popped up in a proportion not seen before. Gruesome crimes dominated the media, and some of these terrifying criminals did claim to have murdered in the name of an all-powerful and evil Satan.
Third, this was a time when conservative Christians in America were a vulnerable population. Following World War II and the Great Depression, a smaller percentage of Americans were Christian, and this number has never fully recovered, sending a message of changing values in America.
Satanic conspiracism goes back a very long way, right? All the way to the Roman Empire. As long as there's been Christians, there's been satanic conspiracism. But to put focus on sort of America and post-World War II, the 50s somewhat, but especially the 60s and 70s, were decades of radical social upheaval.
Additionally, Colorado was in transition, going from a mostly red state to a mostly blue state.
Fourth, it is easier to assume that a group with values or actions opposing you is evil than it is to sit down with genuine respect and an open mind to find a middle ground that likely contains something closer to reality. Extremes are almost never correct.
Finally, misinformation spreads like wildfire in a fearful population. And to defend this fear, no rationale becomes unreasonable.
Think of history as a pendulum. As progressive views become more accepted and mainstream, those with conservative beliefs feel threatened and vice versa. It is isolating and scary when the America reflected back at you doesn't represent your groups or beliefs.
Ronald Reagan was the first president of the so-called New Right, defined by extremely conservative views and in some cases, evangelical beliefs. The New Right was born as backlash to progressive success.
Today, Colorado is one of the more liberal states in the country, being the 6th state to legalize gay marriage in 2014 and the 2nd to legalize the recreational use of marijuana in 2012, and having consistently voted blue since the 2008 presidential election. But in the 80s, it was extremely conservative.
Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election both nationally and in Colorado, with all 7 electoral votes and the popular vote in 60 out of 63 counties in the state at the time. Although he never directly mentioned the Satanic Panic, his policy towards the AIDS epidemic and the war on drugs set a precedent that only the correct America, as determined by conservative views, was worthy of recognition and respect meant to be granted to all citizens.
Marginalized groups such as the gay and lesbian community had made large strides, particularly in Colorado in the 1970s. In 1972, Colorado became one of the first states to decriminalize same-sex sexual activities. In 1973, the Gay Coalition of Denver banded together in the Denver City Revolt to decriminalize 4 sex laws in the city of Denver.
We see a lot of social change happening. Feminist movements gain considerable ground in the 60s and 70s. Now, at the same time in the 70s, we start getting a conservative backlash to this. And in many ways, the Satanic Panic is a continuation of this fight between feminists and conservative women going into the 80s.
New ways of thinking causing the Satanic Panic was even admitted by those deeply believing in a satanic conspiracy at the time. In 1986, a newspaper from Rocky Mountain News, located in Denver, Colorado, interviewed an expert on occult activity. To quote, Jim McCarthy, one of the main whistleblowers of the satanic activity in Colorado, accredits the widespread issue of occult behavior in the state to role-playing games, the boredom of suburban life, heavy metal music, occult books, and the large number of free thinkers who have settled in the Denver area.
Other changes were also setting the stage for a panicked reaction. This decade saw the emergence of violent crimes being broadcast. The Vietnam War brought real-life bloody images to the American living room 24 hours a day. There is something different between reading about something horrible and watching a life end with your own eyes, even across a screen. It's one thing to know the world can be a cruel place, and another to see it.
Satanic cases gained traction around the country, leading to specific accusations in Colorado. A plethora of people were convicted and spent years of their lives in prison before being proved innocent years later nationally. The motivation behind these faulty trials was usually a combination of prejudice and fear.
The evidence in these trials was mainly testimonial from children, who later in life would admit to being coerced into speaking in court. Today, children's testimonial is less relied on in criminal trial, mostly for fear of this, but at the time, necessity to be rid of danger outweighed necessity to put the right person away.
In Colorado, a daycare was accused of ritually abusing children, and the business owner was forced to give up her license and move, although she was never convicted. Eventually, most of these falsely tried individuals were released as lawyers fought to end the false accusations and evidence. This was a main contributing factor to the end of the Satanic Panic.
So what results in the end of the Satanic Panic? Well, it has a pretty slow death. It takes about 6 years for it to finally die down. What ultimately defeats them is that reality catches up to the Satan hunting apparatus. In the late 80s and early 90s, medical studies catch up to the Satan hunters' claims about child abuse. The FBI releases their report in the early 90s, though it had been sort of leaked in the late 80s, that there was no sign of widespread satanic cult activity.
Ultimately, the less bias and extreme the justice system and those in power, the less division, distrust, and fear from those dependent on leadership.
Politicians and the media today far too often make a scapegoat out of their opponent rather than looking at the motivations and fair points of the other. The Satanic Panic and the political era around it show the transition to the arena we have today of disconnection rather than compromising for the best of most people. This has created a society that values their own bias much more than they do the truth.
If there was one takeaway that people could have about the Satanic Panic, is that it can happen again, and it is happening again. QAnon is the successor to the Satanic Panic by its own admission, and if we're not vigilant, we can have the same effects again.
The nationwide fear of the Satanic Panic was born in a reaction to the progressive movements, sensational media, and the social upheaval of the recent years. We can see this repeating pattern happening in front of our very eyes today. The Satanic Panic exemplified repeating historical issues in progression, conservatism, bias, fear, and division. And it shows the consequences on people's lives that come from looking at a person as the groups they are a part of, rather than the person that they are.
While it is far too easy to become complicit and falling into hopelessness that these patterns will forever repeat, the thing that each of us can do is protect our opinion, not trust information blindly, and no matter our differences, respect one another.
Interactions need not be us versus them. Each of us are, in the end, not devil, not angel, but human.